Hey, good morning, everybody. Hope your week is off to a good start. Actually, I guess we're at the halfway point. Wednesday, the middle of this week, as we spend these few minutes together on Wednesday mornings, we call Coffee with PC. I have got my cup of Christmas blend again this week. I'm going to get my enjoyment out of it. It's a seasonal type of thing, and so quite enjoy that. So I wanted to continue to talk about some of the things we talked about Sunday. This is one of those Coffee with PCs where I had a lot more in my notes on Sunday that, I didn't get to. So I thought I'd share some of those thoughts with you. And they're, I guess if I was going to say a theme word around today's thoughts, it would be the word silence. Now, silence is usually, can we say it has a negative connotation? The idea of silence, particularly as we think about the story we talked about Sunday of Zechariah and Elizabeth. They're the parents of John the Baptist who were a little older in age and had never had a child. And while Zechariah is able to go in as a priest into the temple to offer the incense, a great honor for him, chosen by Lot, the angel Gabriel appears to him and tells him that he and his wife are going to have a baby. And this is the first time, what we often call the 400 years of silence, that God speaks to his people. Now, that doesn't mean nothing happened in those 400 years. It's just what we call them sometimes because we have no canonical or biblical record of God speaking through prophets or other ways to his people between the last of the prophets, Malachi, and the first of the New Testament prophets, namely this birth of John the Baptist. And so we call them the 400 years of silence. And we think about silence, usually silence, I guess it also has a positive connotation. I think around Christmas, one of my favorite Christmas carols is Silent Night. It's one of those that every year, and I'm sure we're not the only church, and we didn't patent this idea. A lot of churches probably did it before we did, but we do it as part of our Christmas Eve service. The last thing we do is by candlelight, as we pass the candles and people light their candles, we sing Silent Night. That's one of my favorite memories and moments of the year, and certainly a big part of the sense of Christmas for me, and being a part of that and seeing it from the front is just a beautiful moment. So silence in that sense, Silent Night, that has a nostalgic feel. That's probably a fair thing to say. For me, certainly it does. Maybe it does for you. But in general, I would guess silence is not a positive thing. We think of it as a reprimand, that we should be silent. And maybe we look at that period of time in history. Certainly some of those in the first century, like Zechariah and Elizabeth and other key people trying their best to follow God in that period of time, feeling like in the silence of God that he has forgotten us, that he has abandoned us. And there was lots of reasons that may have been the case. But it's interesting that through the angel, God speaks again. He breaks the silence. And one of the things that also in my mind often goes with silence, particularly as we think about the silence in the 400 years between the testaments, is the fact that in silence we usually have to wait. If you're told to go sit in the corner and be quiet, that obviously a negative thing, but that's a moment of waiting. You're just sitting there. You can't do anything. You're just stuck, we feel like, in this idea of waiting. But one of the unique realities of the story of God in history is that for God's people, waiting is not, number one, a passive thing, and two, it's not a punishment. At times it seems like a normative feature of the things that God is up to in our world. I just jotted down a few in my notes from Sunday, some folks that had to wait quite a long time. We could start with Abraham. He's the first patriarch. He gets the promise from God more than once that he will be the father of a great nation, of many people. As numerous as the stars are in the sky, so will his descendants be. At one point, God says to him. But from the initial time when Abraham receives the promise from God that he would be the father of a great nation, and that through him and his descendants, all people of the earth, all nations of the earth would be blessed, it's about 25 years until his wife gets pregnant. A lot happens in 25 years, and let's suffice it to say Abraham didn't always sit quietly and wait. Sometimes he tried to take matters into her own hand. We talk about that Sunday. We can be control freaks, and when things aren't happening fast enough, particularly in our fast-paced world, we just want to get in there and get things going. And sometimes that's the very worst thing we can do. When God speaks like he did to Abraham, God has a plan, God has timing, and yeah, it was a long time. Waiting 25 years for something. I think about as a kid, as I told you last week, I was not one that liked to wait for Christmas. I liked to snoop around and try to figure out what my presents were. But waiting 25 days in the month of December for Christmas would be agony. Imagine waiting 25 years for something. A little bit later in the same book, the book of Genesis, the first book of the scriptures, we meet a young man by the name of Joseph. And all of his story, as a favorite child of his father, had a special coat of many colors. His brothers hated him for a variety of reasons. Certainly the fact that he was his father's favorite played in there, and the fact that he had these big dreams and shared them with his brothers didn't help. And so when they plotted against him to try to get him out of the picture, out of their anger and hatred toward him, he's shipped off to Egypt, sold to a caravan passing by. And it is about 13 years from the time that Joseph is sold or arrives in Egypt till, through a series of events, not all of them good, Joseph rises to the place of second in command under Pharaoh after he interprets Pharaoh's dreams and sets up a way that the people can prosper. It's the beginning of the process that brings his family back to him, but that takes another 6 or 8 years from the time he reaches the height of his power in Egypt to the time his family comes. That's a long time to wait. Now, maybe that's not the best example because there were negative circumstances. It's not like God, like he told Abraham, hey, you're going to be the father of many nations, and he's just waiting for the promise. Joseph just went through a lot to do that. But another one that got a specific promise, that got told, hey, something is going to happen, is King David. David, the youngest of his father Jesse's children, is anointed as king of Israel as a teenager. And it takes 15 or so years from the time he is anointed. Like the prophet Samuel comes and physically puts the oil of anointing on his head, saying, you will be the next king, until he becomes king. And those intervening years aren't always easy. There are times when he has to run for his life and hide because Saul doesn't like the fact that David's going to be his successor, and he tries to kill him. And so it's not an easy necessarily 15 years, but it involved a long process of waiting. And any time we have an extended period of waiting on God, it feels like, if you've been there, you know what I'm about to say. It feels like God is silent. That we have this promise, like Abraham, like David, and we say, okay, God, you promised, and I'm waiting for it. I know it's coming. And it seems like from the time that we feel like God made that promise to the time it comes true, that in the meantime, he's forgotten that we even exist. The silence of God. And that's a tough place to be in. And Advent has a lot to do. As I said last week, the first week of Advent is about hope. It's about the expectation that God is at work even when the circumstances don't always look like it, even when the circumstances can be incredibly difficult and we can't quite make sense of what's happening in any way. Like, how is this moving things toward what God promised? Well, even then, God is at work and we can trust him. And it's sometimes in that waiting that he forms in us the character to prepare us for what he's doing. One more idea, not just the silence of God, but in this Zechariah story, a part we didn't get to, after this great promise that the angel makes from God to Zechariah, that you'll have a son, John, and he'll be great, and he'll be the one that comes, fulfilling that Malachi, the end of Malachi 4, 5, and 6, chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, prophecy in the spirit and power of Elijah preparing the way of the Messiah. Zechariah is a little dumbfounded and a little questioning, as you might expect. Biologically, there's some things he might be worried about, and just at this point, can we say maybe he's a little cynical, maybe he's a little jaded, like this is never going to happen, and I don't even want to get my hopes up that it's going to happen because I'm just going to be disappointed again. Maybe you felt that way before. Only in this case, we see a conversation and Zechariah sort of, I don't want to say lashing out, but responding to the angel. And guess what his, we'll call it, punishment is, or I'll use the word discipline, is to try to teach him a lesson, not God getting angry and smiting him, but God saying, no, I want you to learn something. What his punishment is? He's struck silent. He can't talk. He is struck silent for that whole period of time until John is born. God wasn't silent in that period of time. God had spoken, and yet Zechariah needed to be struck silent. It's an interesting thing, and I think about that because, when I think about that hymn or that carol, Silent Night, that sense of all is calm, all is bright, that serenity, that peace, that everything's okay because something is happening. There's something about, at times, silence that brings that. We live in a very fast-paced and busy world, and we, as we know, this time of year cram more than we should into a few days of the year, trying to wring every bit of, call it joy or fun or celebration out of it. And sometimes we run ourselves so ragged, we miss it completely. There's a verse, the psalmist writes, Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." Sometimes we get so busy chasing after an experience, a feeling, a memory, something nostalgic, that we miss the moment where God just says, hey, would you just slow down? Would you just hush and be still and know that I am God? And for Zechariah, he had about 9 months where he couldn't speak. And all of the words and the busyness were gone. And I think into that, it became the cradle of his faith to grow. Because one of the first things he says after his speech is restored and his son is born is a great word of confirmation of that God had spoken to him, that God's promise had been fulfilled, as he named his son in a different way than many people would have thought, not after himself or a family name, but he named him John, just like the angel had told him. Sometimes we need, well, let's not get to the point, how's this, that God has to come and shut us up. Sometimes we need to take the initiative and slow down and get quiet and be still so that we can know he is God. I hope in the busyness of this particular time of the year, with all the demands that you may feel placed on you, with all the stuff that you feel like you have to do or must get done, that you'll take some time to be still. And in the beauty of this season, experience the presence and the blessing of knowing God is with us in the person of Jesus. Emmanuel, that's one of his names, God with us, the baby born in Bethlehem. I would encourage you, a couple ways you can practice that silence is setting aside a time to come and worship with us. Yeah, we'll sing some songs. You won't have to, zip your lips or whatever. We'll sing together. We'll look at the Christmas story, some of the other characters that play such an important role in the first Christmas story. We'll worship together. We'll pray together. And then, of course, Christmas Eve, 6 o'clock. I mentioned it earlier, but let me put a plug in. If you're looking for a way to celebrate the birth of Jesus, a moment of kind of quiet, and hopefully that all is calm, all is bright, we would love to have you join us. 6 p.m. December 24th, Christmas Eve candlelight service. We'll be right here. So I know you probably got a lot to do, and I'm going to let you get back at it. I've got some things to do as well, but make some time, just like the psalmist tells us, to be still and know that he is God. So until next week, I'm going to finish my coffee, and we'll catch up then.